Hi friends, today I'm in a bit of a different location because we're going to be talking about something a bit darker, and I wanted to be in a lighter place, not in my dungy basement, because today we are talking about death. Let's jump in. You might be thinking, why are we going to be talking about death? But we're not going to be talking about death as a concept or a reality. We're going to be talking about the personification of death, aka a character. And the reason that we're going to be talking about death as a character is that I have found the more and the more that I've read within the fantasy genre, the more and more times I'm encountering death as a character. And it's interesting the ways that each author will depict death. In certain circumstances, death is this terrible finite thing that you definitely do not want to experience, while in other cases death is gentle, embracing, all-encompassing, and warm. So I want to see why it is that we are so obsessed with death as a character, and how authors have been portraying death over the last several decades. But if we really want to talk about death, we probably have to go back a few hundred years and look at Milton, because Milton is the author of Paradise Lost. Now, in his second book, because you might not know this, Paradise Lost is actually one of 3 books, and it is a trilogy, but in the second book, which focuses on the fall of Adam and Eve, we encounter death as a personified character. It's interesting because the way that death comes into existence is in a rather gruesome way. And that death comes into existence in Milton's take really isn't great, because he likes to have the Holy Trinity, and then in this case is basically created its antithesis and created an unholy trilogy, and that is he has Satan personified and he has sin personified, his daughter. And in this version, Satan rapes Sin, and she then births death. And death then in turn is raped by his mother Sin. So it's this whole really nasty triangle of things going on. But that's one of our first personifications of death. And the understanding that one could read from that is death is the result of Satan and sin. Therefore, death is the absence of God, is the absence of faith, which is an interesting concept. People are still talking about it. If you've ever heard of the short story, How is the Absence of God? I've heard it on Bookborn's channel. We'll link that here. But it is really not a new concept because of the fact that we've been talking about it for the last 100 years. So I found it was interesting that death as a character has existed for quite some time. And in this incarnation of death, we see that it is not a good thing. It is a really bad thing. But I want to jump ahead a ways in time, and I'm going to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. And the reason I'm going to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones is because death kind of became synonymous with these books, with this show. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in this is that there are sayings about death and there are gods of death. So while death himself isn't personified, there are aspects of death that almost are. So one of the things that has probably resonated the most from the show is Arya Stark, our young and adventurous girl who then grows up to be this killing machine. It starts the series with learning how to train in swords with a man from Bravos, the free city, named Syrio Forel. They have an exchange where Syrio says, "There is only one God and his name is death, and there's only one thing that we say to death." And the response is, "Not today." And the thing that kind of came from the show at this point was, what do we say to the god of death? Not today. I thought that that was kind of an interesting thing to discuss, but it's not the only classification of death in Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire with a capital D. And this I thought was kind of interesting because it kind of goes into the religious aspect of the series, and that is we have faceless men and the many-faced god, and we have the stranger of the faith of the 7. Now, for the many-faced god, that cult primarily takes place in Essos, which is not where the bulk of our story takes place unless you're with Daenerys and a few characters that kind of weave in and out. But we see that the faceless men become trained assassins, but their temple is a refuge for people to come and die because death is viewed as a gift, as a blessing, as a mercy. And in many cases, of course, it can be. We look at our modern world, we look at assisted death or doctor-assisted suicide. It's not too different of a concept that you go to this place and someone assists you in dying, and they view that as a very positive thing. But one of the things that I also thought was really interesting is that we see death from a much more negative perspective in the primary religion of Westeros, our other island, if you will, continent, whatever you want to call it. That is the stranger. The stranger is one of the 7 faces of God, they believe, and the stranger represents death. And I thought that there were a few interesting quotes regarding death. Before I am done with her, I promise you she will be singing to the stranger, begging for his kiss. And we have, I thought I was the warrior and Circe the maid, but all the time she was the stranger, hiding her true face from my gaze. And that's Jaime Lannister, also from A Feast for Crows. So we see in this regard that the stranger is really viewed as a negative thing. And of course, these are both capitalized and they are basically death, but they are viewed quite differently. We have the faceless men and the many-faced God who view it as a mercy, and we see that those who view the stranger view him fearfully and think that it is a cruel punishment because it's final, and that is the end. So I thought that these were interesting to discuss, but we're going to jump into more like actual personifications of death going forward. I think that for people of my generation, at least anyway, the one that they will probably recognize the most is death from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, which is where we get a tale from the Tales of Beedle the Bard. We are given the story of the 3 brothers, and this was one of my favorite parts of the book, and I thought that the animation that they did for the film for this was absolutely beautiful. But we come to understand that these 3 brothers are traveling and they come across this bridge. This is a very treacherous bridge where people normally die, and Death is vexed because they managed to trick him because they are wizards and they use their magic to overcome the obstacle of the bridge. Death, wanting to reclaim the souls, makes an agreement with the 3 brothers where he grants them each a boon. They think that this is a good thing when in reality Death is trying to trick them because he knows it's really not a good thing. And this is where we come to have the creation of the Deathly Hallows. The first brother gets the Elder One, the second the Resurrection Stone, and the final and youngest brother has the Cloak of Invisibility, or the Invisibility Cloak. What I loved about this is that Death is still Death who wants souls, but has more dimension to their character in that they are intelligent, they are able to be thinking with their understanding of certain gifts not going to assist the person in the way that they thought they would, especially in the fact that we see that the results of this being that the first 2 brothers both die very early on. But the thing that's most interesting is that the 3rd brother goes on to live a very full life, and he's able to do that and cloak himself from death by using the invisibility cloak. Death is searching for him through all this time, but at the end of this man's life, he removes the cloak of invisibility and Death greets him as a friend. Because they've kind of had this back and forth, it's almost like a catch me if you can situation between Death and the 3rd brother. But I really liked this because it showed that Death had almost a sense of humor, was quizzical, and was just a more roundabout, interesting character. And for me, this was the first time that I had encountered Death as a character when I read Harry Potter. I read it right when the book was released. I went to the midnight showing, so I'm that many years old. I thought this was a really fun way to include Death in a story, but not just have it be Death and to have it be something bigger. I thought that was a really interesting take, and I really still like it to this day. Now, I want to talk about probably my favorite representation of Death, and that is going to be Death of the Endless, and that is from Neil Gaiman's Sandman. The Endless are what they are. They are the Endless, and of that grouping, Death is by far and away just the most excellent, I don't even know if you could call her a person because they're not really human or people, but she has a human form. In the comics, she is a goth girl. She's so sweet, she's so loving, she's so endearing, and she knows her role and her purpose. She even says, for some folks, death is relief. For others, death is an abomination, a terrible thing. But in the end, I'm here for all of them. And another quote by her is, anyway, I'm not blessed or merciful. I'm just me. I've got a job to do and I do it. Listen, even as we're talking, I'm there for old and young, innocent and guilty, those who die together and those who die alone. In the comic, she has a very upbeat personality, despite the fact that she is death. She is warm, embracing, encouraging, and she is whom I would want to greet me at the end of my life. I, like many others, was so excited when I saw that there was going to be an adaptation of this for Netflix. I love Neil Gaiman adaptations. I feel like so far they've done a really good job with pretty much all of them except American Gods. That one was no good. I will say that I feel like racism and fantasy adaptations are becoming intrinsically linked, and this is a bad thing for our community. I'm going to say that again. This is a bad thing for our community. And when they cast Kirby Howell-Baptiste to play Death, I thought she was a great choice because I've seen her in other things. I really liked her in The Good Place, and I loved her in Why Women Kill. So I had no qualms with this. I thought, we don't need someone that looks like the comic book character to bring this character to life. And she did such a phenomenal job. I don't know if they could have found anyone that was better. In the show, she has such a compassionate and caring touch, to the point where I was in tears when she picks up a baby because the baby has died in their crib. She greets an elderly man who's formerly a musician, and she doesn't want him to stop playing his instrument. She's there for a young man on the field as he's about to die. It was just so well executed, and Death in the comic and Death in the adaptation for the show was immaculately done. I don't know if there is a better version of Death. There are different versions for sure, if you like more somber, more comical, what have you, but she is hands down my favorite. We're going to talk about a comical one now because we need to put a comical one in the midst of everything, and that is going to be Death from Terry Pratchett's Discworld. And I feel like it is important to talk about him because he is very, very funny. He is skeletal, has bright blue eyes, likes curry, likes cats. He takes on an apprentice named Mort. He is a collector of souls, but he is not the reason that souls die. No, no. I kill, said Death, obviously offended. Certainly not. People get killed, but that's their business. I'd just take over from then on. After all, it'd be a bloody stupid world if people got killed without dying, wouldn't it? He is such a funny character, and I love that Terry Pratchett did this. Of course, it totally fits in with the greater schematics of Discworld that he would have Death as a personified character who is funny, satirical, comedic, warm in some ways, but he is a unique take on Death, really, because Death, even though it can be portrayed in many different ways, is rarely funny and rarely has quite a story arc such as this. Terry Pratchett's Death appears in several different books. There are so many different times that Death is popping up, and it's great because you get to learn more about this character, dive into that world with them, and it's super enjoyable. But that's not the only time that Terry Pratchett has written about Death, and it's not a Discworld book, but it's a collaborative book, and it's one of my favorite books ever written, and that would be Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Some people often wonder if this is the same Death that is in Discworld, and it is not. Death in this case is one of the Four Horsemen, and in this case we don't get quite as fleshed out of a character, especially because the book is fairly short, but Death isn't one of the main characters in this book, of course, because he's one of the four men and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Death is going to be important. Death is kind of all over the world, cleaning up the messes of the other three: war, pestilence, famine, and he loves a motorcycle. He rides a motorcycle. He's a skeleton. He's got a shade down, but that doesn't mean that they don't give him a personality. I think he's fairly witty and very funny. Two of the quotes that I thought resonated specifically were, "I do not understand. Surely your very existence requires the end of the world. It is written. And don't think of it as dying. Think of it as leaving early to avoid the rush." And I thought that these were very funny because that's just how they decided to write Death, and I appreciate that. It's the fact that these two authors have written Death before, and they've done it both differently, and I feel like it's interesting that they're able to take this same concept, this same character, and personify them in different ways, and I think that's really fascinating. If you want to deviate from literature a little bit, a good movie, an old movie if you want to go back and watch it, is The Seventh Seal, where Death himself is a character. He is one of the two main characters in the movie. I am not going to give a description for this because I feel like it would give away a good part of the plot, and it's really worth a watch. It is an excellent old film if that is yours. I find it interesting that we have been personifying death for the last few hundred years. I think it's probably a way in our psychosis to try to grapple with the fact that one day death will come for you, it will come for me, and understand how we feel about our mortality, about our existence, and who we would necessarily want to greet us at the end. It could also be what we just expect to greet us at the end, or what we definitely hope doesn't greet us at the end. All in all, it's interesting that different authors take different approaches to the same concept and have created it into a character. And I will leave you with a quote surrounding death by an ancient Greek philosopher called Epicurus, and that is, "Why should I fear death? If I am, then death is not. If death is, then I am not. Why should I fear that which can only exist when I do not? And I love that. I think that's a great way to end it. If you like these types of videos, you can let me know in the comments below, or also if I missed any personification of death that you think is really important, I'm happy to check it out. If you would like to help support me, you can hit like and subscribe and turn that little bell notification on so you won't miss any future videos. And if you'd like to keep up with me on Instagram to see what I'm reading, you can find me at Fantasy Awash. And as always, I will see you next time. Bye.